Okay, thank you all for coming here on a beautiful Saturday, competing with Mount Fuji over there. Uh, our panel here is really about how to create innovation systems. And I thought at the beginning, each of us will talk about 5 minutes introducing himself or herself. And I'll start by kind of setting the stage here for our discussion. And what we thought is we'll cover more or less 4 topics. And one of them is which are the key factors to create innovation systems. And we thought you need good universities at the core because they bring ideas, they bring people, they bring solid training. You need speed, it's got to be fast. You need money and clever money. You need excellence, good people, and trust. Then we want to talk a little bit about what we can learn from each other. You will hear that we come from very, very different experiences. Each one of us here has a lot of experience in completely different areas. So what can we learn from each other? And then we have a topic which I think Bill introduced, which is nurture versus nature, or DNA versus environment. So how much of it comes from within us, from our hearts, and how much is kind of imposed from the environment. So now maybe each one of us can introduce about 5 minutes. Let's start with Bill.
Sure. Is this on? Is this on? Yeah. Now it is. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome from Canada, eh? Has anyone actually been to Canada? Fantastic. Then you know that Canada, in comparison to Japan, is about a quarter the population and about 25 times the size geographically. So we have an awful lot of land to fit an awful lot of people. My history is I've been an entrepreneur for about 20 years. I've been in venture capital, and for the last 5 or 6 years, been part of developing an innovation ecosystem in Vancouver, in that area. And one of the interesting things about Canada is we've been actually fairly good at inventing things. Just imagine for a moment, we were the ones that invented the pager, which eventually became BlackBerry devices. Anyone heard of BlackBerry before? Okay, a few of you, yes, okay, great. So you weren't born 10 years ago, that's good. We also invented the IMAX cinema, so for those that watch IMAX movies, that was invented in Canada. Of course, you would know that we invented ice hockey, but I bet you didn't know that we invented basketball. So there's a few things in Canada that people don't actually hear much about. But despite the fact that we're really good inventors, I think one of the things that we've really worked on probably the last 10 years for sure, and maybe going back 20 years, is to build a more robust and fast-growing innovation ecosystem that can scale to the size that we would all like to drive our economic growth. So in Canada, there are probably 3 major regional ecosystems. There's one that's based in Toronto, another one that's based in Montreal, and then Vancouver is probably the 3rd largest one. Each one has slightly different characteristics. In Vancouver, we have a population of about 2.5 million people. It's been for the last 4 or 5 years one of probably the fastest growing technology ecosystem in the country, but it came from a fairly small underpinning. So a lot of that came because in 2010 we hosted the Olympic Games in Vancouver, and that brought the world to our doorstep and kind of showed off the kinds of things that we could do. So some of the key specialties that we have in Vancouver are around digital entertainment and creative. So Hollywood North exists there. We developed 2 of the top 6 video games there. So from a video game development standpoint, I think many Japanese companies have looked at Vancouver as a great beachhead to kind of develop their studios. The other area that we're quite strong in is around quantum computing. So one of the big trends around quantum computing actually originates with a company in Vancouver. And more recently, I think a lot of the efforts around sustainability and environment, clean energy, things like hydrogen fuel cells, and some of the technology around alternative power and energy actually originate from Vancouver. So those are some of the things in our ecosystem. The biggest learning, I think, is it takes a while to develop an innovation ecosystem. And in fact, you can map it to the stage of growth, not unlike a company. We're probably at maybe at the adolescent stage in our development. So if you consider that there's a mature stage that's maybe on the fourth stage of the horizon, we're probably in the second stage. And I think what we need more than anything to scale it is to build larger companies with greater propensity to kind of develop the underpinnings to seed the success of more companies going forward. So that's really the state of the nation for us.
Thanks, Billy. Noah, you're next.
So I'm Noa. I'm actually the head of the Israeli Economic Mission in Japan. I've been here for 4 years, enjoying every minute of it. So maybe I can start just like Bill has. Has anybody been to Israel? Oh, wow. So that's a large group. So I don't know how the others are familiar with Israel. Israel is a very small country. We have only 8.5 million people, and the size of Israel is actually equivalent to the size of Shikoku Island. We are in a lack of natural resources, but we've been able to develop Israel as the startup nation. We have actually 6,000 startups in Israel active all the time, with about 1,500 new startups that are being established every year. We are considered to be one of the top innovative countries by the WEF ranking and by other rankings. We have the largest patents per capita, the largest percentage of researchers and scientists in terms of population. And we are considered to be an innovation hub. When we talk about nature versus nurture, I feel that it's the answer is, of course, both in creating a successful ecosystem. In terms of the nature, actually, Jack Ma was in Israel, and he said that innovative in Israel is very natural. It's like water and food. And I think this is really coming from our internal flame. In order to become an entrepreneur and in order to become innovative, you really have to be hungry. And in Israel, you see it as a kind of a survival mode. We are in a very rough neighborhood. We lack the natural resources. And in order to survive, we have to keep on innovating. We have to keep on dreaming and looking at the future. The Israeli government actually plays a very big role in creating this very unique ecosystem that sometimes it's considered to be one major kind of accelerator for startups. And the key authority that does that is the Israeli Innovation Authority. I actually used to work in that authority before. And what this kind of authority does is creates all those types of schemes that help Israeli entrepreneurs in various stages. So from training to seed to more mature companies. But in the last maybe almost 40 years, actually, it has been able to create some major breakthrough technologies. Two of the programs that I wanted to mention, the first one is the Yozma Fund that was established in the 1990s. And it's actually a fund that established the Israeli VC community, which I think is a major part of the Israeli ecosystem. The other program is called the Technological Incubator Program that was established in 1990, actually in order to absorb 1 million immigrants that we had from Russia. So at that time, it was 20% of the Israeli economy. And we had a lot of Jewish immigrants coming from the former Soviet Union. And a lot of them were scientists and researchers and engineers. And we were looking for places for them to work and also kind of use their capabilities. And this program actually created those incubators, mostly in peripheral areas, where in each of them there were actually 28 incubators. In each of them there were about 10 projects. And the government has supported those projects directly. And it had created 2,000 startups out of this program. So those are maybe the two very unique programs that Israel had in order to create this ecosystem. But when I look at the ecosystem, I think that the major role of the government is actually connecting the different dots, the different pillars of the ecosystem. So you spoke about the academic institutions, the money, the funding. In Israel, we also see multinational corporations. We have 350 research institutes, centers of multinational corporations. Rakuten is one of them. And it's all creating this unique ecosystem that we have in Israel. So this is my part.
Thank you, Nora. I think Kaji-san, would you like to talk next?
Sure. Thanks. How many of you are living in Japan right now? Okay. How many of you are working for Rakuten? Okay, interesting. I'd like to touch up on the situation in Japan a little bit, even though you are not aware of that. We have been facing that very serious three situations. One is quick emergence of China. China's technology is rapidly increasing, so we have to deal with that as a government in Japan. And also, second one is the very serious shrinking populations, which is never the humankind experiencing. These two serious situations combined with long-lasting administrations, Japan started to transform, I think it's 3 years ago. And mainly the stability of the administrations, Japanese society started to changing. And this year, there are two monumental things was happening in May. One is that the chairman of Hitachi, Nakanishi-san, was appointed as a chairperson for the Keidanren. Hitachi is the driving force of the transformation in Japanese big industry. That is one. And second one is that Mercari went to public, which generated $7 billion. So these two things is very symbolic, which shows the Japanese transformations. By the way, my track record was a combination between public sector and private sector. After 25 years of experience in company like Coca-Cola, Time Warner, Sony Pictures, and Nissan, I joined Prime Minister's office and spent 3 years there, which was between 2011 January to 2013 December. I have 3 years of track record in working in the Prime Minister's office. During that period, I experienced the dealing with the great Tohoku earthquake, which combining disaster between tsunami and nuclear issues, which had a huge impact on our society. And second job was, second year we experienced the administration change from Minshuto to Jiminto, which again, that's a big transformation for Japan. And third year we won the Tokyo Olympics for the next milestone events, which you mentioned a little bit. So combining these three experiences, I feel that that's now Japan has a great opportunity upcoming 3 to 5 years. Next year we are going to have a Rugby World Cup and G20s, and also 2 years from now we're going to have Olympics, and most likely or hopefully we are going to get the 2025 Expo in Kansai, Osaka area, which is rising star in Japanese economy. So combining those situations, I think now the time to stand up, especially the people like you coming from all over the world to Japan. I think that's a great opportunity, timing to create the ecosystem, and you will be the part of the ecosystem.
Thank you, Kaji-san. So, I came first to Japan in '84. At that time, I had just finished my, finished my PhD in Cambridge, and I saw Japan. I came here to establish some research cooperation with NTT labs, and I realized Japan is strong in technology. The links at that time, at least to outside, were still very weak. Still today, it's quite weak, or could be much stronger. So, and it's difficult. So I thought that Japan is right for me, and so I live here since '91. But before that, one of the reasons I went to Cambridge was because Cambridge was the only place at that time in all of Europe which had a emerging startup sphere ecosystem. So that's why I went there. And my aim was always to start up a company. And I ended up doing that now here in Japan. And so now I build foreign companies up. I have my own company for 20 years. And working so long for Japan, it's very interesting to see how things change here. And I think, like Kaji-san said, I think foreigners, like 20 years ago, nobody would have listened to me. You know, actually 20 years ago, I saw many of these issues here. You know, I was a manager in Hitachi. You mentioned Hitachi, so I was a manager in Hitachi, and within about 24 hours, I realized that's not for me. And at that time, and so at that time, 20 years ago, I think it was hard to convince people here that change is necessary. But as Kaji-san, who has worked in the top office here in Japan, has said, you know, even at the top office now, the change is being driven, you know. And at least I think us three here, we are driving some of that change. So each one of us has different tools. So I have my own tools. My major tool is here, my brain. I don't have so much else, but the main thing is the brain. Huh? And so I drive with that. I have my own company. I was on the board of directors of a Japanese stock market listed cybersecurity company, and I was driving in that in that company for change. And it's a public company, so you can check it out. It's called GMO Cloud. And in the time I was on the board of directors, the value of the company increased by a factor of 3 or 4, roughly. And not just because of my work, but maybe I contributed. And so I think one of the main things here in our panel is really to how we can learn from each other. Each one here has done different things. So what I thought is we'll start by 2 countries which are kind of most far from each other, both in distance and also in the circumstances, which is Israel and Japan. So why don't you, Noa and Kaji-san, have a conversation about what you can learn from each other?
May I have a question? No, you have 4 years of experience in Tokyo. So what is the difference you feel? You were in Israel and you were in Tokyo.
So really, Israel and Japan are not just far geographically, but also maybe culturally. It's 180 degrees difference between Israeli and Japanese. I think, you know what, maybe I can tell my personal story. So I arrived here about 4 years ago, and my role is to create collaboration between Israeli companies and Japanese companies. And 4 years ago, I remember myself in the in the Tokyo Metro, going from one company to another, from one economic organization to another, and really knocking on the doors and telling them, you have to collaborate with Israel. We really kind of complete each other. And, you know, most of the people that I talked to were quite kind of indifferent about it. They didn't really care. And I can tell you now that after those 4 years, I don't have to go through the tunnels of Tokyo Metro anymore, because I have so many companies that are coming to me realizing that collaborating with Israeli startups, with Israeli companies, could really help them compete in the global world. And we feel really that creating collaboration between Israeli companies and Japanese companies is really creating a synergy. We used to say that Israelis are good in creating 0 to 1 and Japan is 1 to 100. But I actually had Ide-san, the former CEO of Sony, visit Israel, and when he came back, he said that Israel is good in creating -1 to 1, thinking of disruptive technologies and bringing them to the market. But then Israel cannot, Israeli startups are, you know, very small usually. They cannot thrive in the international market, and they really depend on those larger international global leaders. And this is why I feel that really working together and creating this collaboration is so great and so successful. And you hear more and more about the open innovation that is now more kind of becoming kind of a trend of Japanese corporations. But I feel that it will take a little bit longer until they create a kind of internal process to integrate the outside innovation into their companies.
So you think Japanese companies started to be more open?
I
To the-
see it definitely.
Oh, you
Japanese
think so?
companies are more open now than they used to be before. Not just the big, kind of Fortune 500 ones, but also smaller type of companies. They're really looking at new businesses. They're looking to innovate. They're looking to learn from others, to integrate other innovation that is coming outside of the company. And this is a great trend.
I think, as far as I understand, that the number of the startups per capita is much, much larger than Japan in your country. And you say that Israel is pretty strong in creating minus to zero. In that sense, that investors, like angel investors, going to play a very important role because the number of the angel investors is much, much smaller compared in Israel and Japan. So how do you find that the importance of the angel investors?
Of course, angel investors, and I said before, even the government play a really crucial role in Israel for helping those startups or those entrepreneurs start a company. Without them, without funding, which is one major pillar of the ecosystem, they could not exist. And I'm really happy to see more Japanese investments now being done in Israel. There are some major acquisitions of companies in Israel as well. And I hope this trend will continue.
Great, great.
You mentioned Keidanren before.
Oh, yeah.
Interesting thing is, I don't know how many of you know, but I think Rakuten left Keidanren, so that's quite interesting. So why don't you, Bill, so what's your view from Canada?
Well, what's interesting is listening to the conversation about Israel and Japan, I kind of feel that Canada is somewhere in between. We share a lot of the same characteristics as Israel, in that we rely a lot on our export market to succeed. We're a very small nation, so the domestic market is not that large. And markets like Japan, and we've been quite fortunate, we have a special relationship with Japan that we've had for many years. And I think that access to those markets are increasingly important to us. And for most of the companies that operate in the innovation ecosystem in Canada, their first market is the United States. And what's amazing is as I listen to Noah's kind of description of the many programs that Israel has put in, I think Canada has, to a large extent, followed many of the same principles in rolling out innovation approaches, trying to support early stage investment, and trying to build the culture of entrepreneurship there. And yet, I think in the end, our relationship with markets like Japan and the United States remains one of being somewhat smaller. And so we're always looking to build bridges to get from the 1 to the 100 or what have you. And so my question, I think, would be on the Japanese side, what would be the most important things you would say are necessary for Canadian companies to succeed in markets like Japan so that we can build deeper relationships?
I think the starting point for that kind of things is that passion to deal with the risks. The risk awareness is one of the biggest source of the passion. The reason why the Japan started to be transformed is that Japanese domestic market is no more growing because of the shrinking populations. And also, as I mentioned, that there are emerging big tigers is next to us. So that awake the Japanese big companies, which is symbolized by the Keidanren's transformations. So if you are very serious about transformation, you might have some passions inside of yourself. What is that source of passion? You have to ask yourself. The most likely it should be some of the risk awareness or some of the awareness of the responsibility and those kind of things. The reason why Israel is rising star in innovation is based on that your countries as far as I understand, countries is always full of awareness of the risks and how to deal with issues. So while I was walking around these buildings, lots of people who are passionate about innovations, I think they want to see some of the opportunities driven by some of the risk awareness. That's my personal view.
Well, from Europe, I mean, many Europeans see Israel quite close to Europe, or maybe even part of Europe. And but one of the problems we have in Europe is that when you look at the internet age, Rakuten is an internet company and a very large global one with global impact. And another Japanese internet company with big global impact is SoftBank. And like Kaji-san mentioned, we have now Mercury emerging, and there are several others. So in Japan, you find now this kind of positive feedback loop between very successful startup ventures which grow into big giants like Rakuten. And in Europe, there isn't any company like that, really. And I had many discussions here with the EU embassy people or EU people coming over here, and they know that. And so that's a very big problem for Europe, really. And so I think Europe can learn also from Japan how to create globally important companies like SoftBank or Rakuten. And that's a big thing we can learn from Japan, I think, from Europe. But in order to learn, you also need an open mind, and you can't close off your mind. And I think still the connection between Japan and abroad to outside countries is still quite weak. It's too weak, So I think one of our jobs, all our jobs really, is Kaji-san's in the cabinet office, and now yours by coming in. And I mean, your Noah's job in the Israeli office, of course, is your #1 job is to open up Japan for Israel. And I do the same also between Europe and Japan, and also US-Japan, but in a different way. And another thing which is quite an interesting experience I had recently, I'm working now with one of the towns here in Japan, with a town government on a particular project. And I told the town government people, Shiakusho people, I told them, but you are responsible for the economic development in your town. And do you know what they answered? They said, this is the first time anybody told that to us. And I'm a European guy, they only talk Japanese. It's a local government town, and when you come into the office, it's only tax, corporate tax and this tax and this tax. So their main job, I think, is collecting tax and, repairing the roads and so on. And I told them, look, because I negotiate some things with them. And so I said, but you are responsible for developing the economy in your town, yeah? So I think our job, like you Canadian coming to Japan or you coming from Israel, is to open the dimensionality of thinking. There's a book called, what's the book called? It's a two-dimensional, I forgot the title of the book. It's about living in a two-dimensional world. And it's about a society of people who live like shadows on a piece of paper. And it's really written as a mathematics book, but it also teaches sociology. And so like by going from one country to the other, it kind of adds dimensions to your experience space. And I think therefore this type of exchange is very important. There's very, very much we can learn from each other. And yeah. Flatland, that's right, Flatland. And Flatland, I worked 5 years at Tokyo University, and at that time I was trying to understand my experience coming from Cambridge University to Tokyo University, and I think Flatland is one of the kind of seminal books in that area. It's really a mathematics book. It's written by a mathematician to teach dimensionality. Maybe those of you who are mathematicians or physicists, you will know that there's 1 dimension, 2 dimension, 3 dimension, 4 dimension, 5 dimensional space, and there's also fractional space, the 3.5 dimensions. And this type of thing is quite difficult to imagine, even if you're a mathematician or physicist. So that book helps it, but it has an application also in sociology. interestingly.
Well, it's a very interesting point because you look at companies like Rakuten and the footprint that they have in so many countries, and you look at the effects on local ecosystems. And one of the things that we talked about was the importance of perspective that you gain from broader connections. So if you look at all the studies on the fastest growing startup communities or the most, the most pronounced innovation ecosystems, they're the ones that have the deepest connections to more places because the startups there benefit from the understanding of how it works in other places. So you get an accelerated learning experience. And the importance of having local anchors or those that actually are part of that ecosystem to kind of guide and provide those elements on it are a critical piece. So my question to Noah is, because Israel has obviously been one of these truly well-connected global ecosystems, what are the secrets to building successful, communities that way, and what can we learn from Israel?
So, Israel is only 70 years old. We are kind of a land of...
It's more like 3,000 years.
yeah, but we were re-established in 1948. We are a land of immigrants. So people came to Israel from all over the world. We have Europeans, Eastern Europeans. We have people that came from Tunisia, from Morocco, from Africa, from Yemen, from Ethiopia, from Russia. And it's, I think, coming from all those countries is really what helped create this great network. Israeli startups cannot survive by themselves. So I used to work as a lawyer for a group of startups, and day one of establishment, we first of all register our company in Delaware. So the mother company would be an American company, the kind of R&D center would be an Israeli company, the subsidiary. So from day one of establishment, we used to look outside of Israel and look for the connections outside. So we were so kind of dedicated to other foreign markets. And creating the network is really what makes Israeli companies survive. So it's really essential for us. And it's not just connecting, the global network, but it's also connecting, kind of creating a local network. So I think one of the key successful factors for a successful ecosystem is to create a collaboration within the ecosystem. So connect between the different pillars of the ecosystem. So it's not just that you have a good academic institutions, but it's also about connecting them to the industry, connecting them to the government, connecting them to the money, to the funding. So this is really, really, I think, important. And I think Japanese companies are starting to realize that the importance of international collaboration and the open innovation, as well as the local kind of collaboration.
In Japan, World Economic Forum just studied that fourth industry Center for Fourth Industry Revolutions just July, and that centered chairperson was dispatched from Ministry of Ministry of Trade and Industry. Also, she's a woman. Yeah. And that is the first initiative for Japanese government to tie in with World Economic Forum, which is the sign for the government. Even the government has the intention to link with the multi-stakeholder communities, including startups, venture capitals, and public sector and private sector. So I think that was the great examples of the linking with that defined dots, as you pointed out.
Coming back to, it's interesting listening to those two stories because coming back to Gerhard, your original remarks about nature versus nurture and culture. So what I heard you say, Noah, was there's a natural tendency for the folks in Israel to want to connect, to openly want to network and learn something about others. I think Canadians are similarly that way. This is my first experience to Tokyo, and I find the culture fascinating. I wonder, Kanji-san, if you could maybe just share with us the perspective about culture in the context of sort of the democratic principles around startups and how that goes in most countries, and how Japan is going to adapt to sort of the realities of new startup culture.
Japan is basically the top-down country, and given the leadership of the administration, they say that startups is going to be the key. Then everybody's following. In addition to that, some of the very symbolic companies like Rakuten, Fast Retailing, SoftBank, and maybe a little bit of Mercari. These are the kind of.
Are there many more? There's Uniqlo.
First Retailing. But that's it. They're so successful, and the government is noticed that they are some of the symbol to be able to be survive in the global settings. So, but the administration is trying to tap into those kind of not conventional examples. So that is the decision of the government. Then the followers started to follow, because Japan is kind of top-down cultures, which might be effectively utilized in that situation, given some of the serious risks in front of us, which is shrinking population and emergence of the China.
But if I may comment, I think Rakuten, I'm not so sure, but SoftBank is definitely not top-down, but bottom-up. Because, I mean, you know, Masayoshi Son, he wanted to burn himself in the ministry if he doesn't get the permission for his high-speed internet company, you know. And what I saw
interestingly, that Toyota and SoftBank just started the joint initiative a week ago.
Yeah.
So that is a sign of...
Like Honda is another example of a bottom-up venture. No?
It's both. If you look at Japanese companies, you see that it's going from top-down and bottom-up.
I think because you worked in a government office, you wanted to have it bottom-down.
No, but
there's also some bottom-up left, I think.
I do agree with him that really...
you're completely right.
Bringing the administration, you can see it in terms of the relationship between Israel and Japan. So getting those kind of instructions from the top, when Prime Minister Abe visited Israel in January 2015, and when Keidan Ren visited, and they said that it's okay to do business with Israel. It's beneficial to both sides. It really created the great collaboration that we see now. So it's really top-down.
Of course, it's easier to work with the government than against the government. Yeah. But like, I think you need this constructive friction. What I thought is we have a few minutes left, so maybe if there are some if there are some questions here from the audience, no question is stupid. Ask anything you like. So we have maybe 2-3 questions we can have. Here's your chance to ask people from many different countries. If you have any questions to, from a person who's very familiar with Kaji-san, with the Prime Minister's office and what they think of with Israel or Canada or Europe. So please go ahead if you have questions here. Yes, we have one here. Introduce yourself also, but only short. And only questions, please, no talks.
I think I should be simple on mine. When you guys make decisions on which companies to go with or to work with globally, is it as simple as everybody, or do you guys have guidelines or kind of like a process to follow, objective, a metric or something like that?
Well, in my case, we work with many companies, with my company, many. And I find that companies have like DNA, There's, I think, good companies have, every company has its own culture. And very often that culture is driven by like the founder. So I'm sure in the Rakuten, I'm not an employee, I've never worked inside Rakuten, but I have many friends at Rakuten. So I don't think I'm wrong by saying that a lot of the DNA of Rakuten is driven by Mr. Mikitani, the founder. And there are quite a few companies who have this founder-driven or owner-driven DNA. But then you have other companies which are more like bureaucratic, and so the DNAs of the companies are very different. So what do you think?
For me, it's a matching point of view. So it's a kind of what is the demand? What can Israeli companies offer to certain Japanese corporations? But I can tell you that before coming to Japan, I knew of the large conglomerates. I knew of the Panasonic and Sony and the NTTs and Rakuten, of course. But I find out now that there are so many kind of smaller companies with maybe annual revenue.
Well, there are
of-
3,500 on the
right,
stock exchange
yeah, or
alone.
yeah. So there are so many companies here, and really there are so many opportunities for collaboration, and a lot of them are now looking at new technologies and new businesses. So there's just to choose, really.
Well, globalization is the word, the buzzword. Except Japan, lots of advanced countries like the U.S. or EU countries do not judge themselves we are global or not, because they're based on that hypothesis their business is going to be global. The reason why Japan as a company has been deal with that question is that two situations was there. One is Japanese. Because of the barrier of the Japanese, we have to deal with that.
You mean the language?
Language barriers and physical barriers, because we are insurer country. To work in a domestic market, which is large enough to maintain that relatively modest growth, was until the 1990s, is a relatively reasonable strategy for the Japanese company. But then again, that China and the shrinking population, we have to get out of that borders. So then the question comes to the definition of the issues you have to deal with. The issue is going to be, if the global, your company should be global. But if the issues you have to deal with is going to be domestic, your strategy should be domestic. So that is going to be the definition of the issues or topics which you want to deal with.
Okay, I think that's our time is reached now. Thank you so very much for coming.
we have
And yeah. Sorry?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
If
Please,
there's
please,
another
please.
question.
Sure. Go ahead.
Well, your question, are you from Canada, by the way? New York. Oh, okay. Your question was a very Canadian question, by the way. It's like, how do you pick all the companies that you could work with? How do you pick them? And Josh is here from the Canadian consulate. So I think this is a question that crosses their desk every day. And there's no easy formula, because the ones that you pick are the ones that you favored, perhaps, or the ones that you think are going to have the greatest chance of success. In the end, the most important part is that you are picking, because there's no way you can support everyone on that journey.
So, how's it? Yeah.
Can I ask another question?
Yes, please. Yeah.
You said earlier, earlier you mentioned that once after entering the Prime Minister office, the big earthquake occurred in 2011. How do you think this impacted Japanese innovation? Because I heard a lot about it from different angles. It brought new communities into innovation. It brought new funding and more of government support. How did you see that from your position back then?
That incident remind us that the simple truth: we are going to die, and we don't know when that is going to happen, and you don't have another same life, which is pretty much the simple fact. Mikitani-san is saying about in front of you. So Rakuten has been very competitive because he knows that truth. And reminding that truth made the transformation quicker in Japan, especially for the millennials generations, which born after 1980s. They started to be the business person pretty recently. They know that limitation of the life, and they are aware of that global issues. That is why the people started to be very innovative, even in a country like Japan. That's my observation.
We had one question back here. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, my question is about Japan. In this case, big companies have been trying to globalize. What about the SMEs in Japan? I mean, what is the transformation needed for those SMEs?
If you take a look at the future investment plan 2018, which is issued by the administration. There is clear mention about how to deal with SMEs. So why don't you take a look at that?
Well, I know some Japanese SMEs which are very, very global.
By the way, SMEs is small and medium-sized enterprise. That's what you mean, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I know some excellent Japanese small, medium enterprises and which are global, you know. And usually I think it depends on the founder. SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, are very much driven by founder or founder's family or owner's family. Usually they're privately owned. And it depends very much on this. I can give you one example. I have a great Japanese friend whose father founded a specialty gas company. And he unfortunately recently died at the age of 104. And he still saw his customers, you know, at the age of 103. And he sent his daughter to MIT and to Chicago. And she's now the CEO of the company. And she married a Japanese gas, American gas, especially a gas company owner. And in that particular case, the father globalized his gas company by sending his daughter to MIT and to Chicago. And it's the wisdom of the founder of the company. And, you know, to start now this company is one of the most important gas companies in Japan and also globally respected gas company. And it's his vision, really. And
So that's the epilogue to the Flatland story, right?
exactly.
That's part of that whole
that's
thing.
the opposite of the Flatland story. And one of my experiences in Japan is that the most amazing stories are often not where the officials think it is, you know. So one example is I wrote a book with the Nobel Prize winner Shuji Nakamura, who invented the LEDs, yeah. And I mean, he's in Annan in Tokushima, and he's born in Shikoku. And like if you if you read the official story of innovation in Japan, they will say, oh, the most innovative is Sony and Hitachi, and the innovation of Japan is driven by Hitachi. And I don't think so. I don't think so. On the contrary, I think they slow down the innovation, you know. I think the innovation comes from completely unexpected places. Like, for example, who was thinking that Mikitani is going to create this big company? Or, like Shuji Nakamura, who revolutionized the lighting industry. Not yet in this room, I think, but yes, he did, you know, and that was in Annan, you know. It wasn't in Central Research Lab of Hitachi, not at all. They tried, but they failed, you know. Often, like, it's this thing about being hungry, you know, like what you mentioned. You have to be hungry. Steve Jobs said that also, I think. No? Okay.
Are there any specific policies in Israel for specific policies for SMEs in Israel?
They're also SMEs.
Yeah, I think, you know, when you look at Israeli companies, they're all SMEs or even just DS, so they're very small companies. So all the policies are relevant to SMEs as well.
Thank you all for coming. I think we have had our time here. Thank you so much also for the excellent questions here. They were all super good questions. And thank you all here for participating. No, 40.